So my name's Kelsie Nabben. I'm a PhD researcher at RMIT University in the Centre for Automated Decision Making and Society. And so I'm coming towards, the final stretch kind of write-up phase. And I'm excited to share with you on the concept of self-infrastructuring and resilience in decentralized technologies as self-infrastructuring. So I'm going to take you through some fundamental building blocks of this and then kind of leave as much time as possible for discussion for whoever's able to stay on. So I guess the first building block conceptually here is the idea of infrastructuring. And this comes out of the literature review from infrastructure studies and is fundamentally around the practice of doing. And so infrastructure is these composable foundations in society. So we're talking about social and institutional dynamics, technical dynamics, and the kind of material forms which create a substrate by which to conduct activities upon. And so infrastructuring is the verb of this concept, really. And I've included some key literature on this, an early work by Starr and Bowker, and these were scholars that were looking at the early days of the internet, And so Starr especially uses ethnographic practices, which is the disciplinary methodology that my work is grounded in. And then there's a few different angles of this, and I wanted to kind of include how some of this work builds. And so there's the idea of participatory design, and I wouldn't by any stretch say that I was doing design ethnography, but sort of different edges of this idea from within infrastructure studies. There's also the idea of infrastructures and the formation of publics. So Larkin says that all infrastructure is political. And so this idea that through infrastructuring, through the practice of infrastructuring, you're actually doing a political act, such as creating new kind of democratic or participatory spaces, as well as just, doing technology or doing organization. That isn't so concise even in that work. It's still very much embedded in the kind of microcosm of participatory design rather than emphasizing this idea of publics in the kind of Habermas sort of sense. And then there's another one on publics. And so what I found in my research is that the practices going on in decentralized technology communities, which I define as, I specifically looked at blockchain as kind of an instantiation of decentralized technology, but actually all of my case studies are sort of peer-to-peer or distributed protocols, not necessarily blockchain. And I define that as open source, peer-to-peer, utilizing cryptography, and this idea of both architectural decentralization, so physical distribution of the infrastructure, as well as political decentralization. So some dynamic which is about not having a central point of authority or someone who can kind of exert political influence directly over the system to control it. And so what I find is that, self-infrastructuring for these communities or how infrastructure occurs is that people need to be able to participate in designing, owning, operating, governing, and or maintaining their own infrastructure for resilience. And so resilience isn't necessarily what people are seeking to achieve through decentralized technologies. It's more a potential byproduct of these self-infrastructuring practices. But there is a very real kind of threat model. I start my research in the kind of historical origins of the concept of resilience and how this has evolved through distributed communication systems with Paul Barron and kind of US military comms networks to the kind of public key cryptographers. And so the public key cryptographers kind of developed this idea that there should be free access to private communications. And then I sort of emphasized this subculture called the cypherpunks that are very seminal in sort of synthesizing a lot of these ideas into this political ideology, which can be summed up in a quote in my research by Zuko, actually, of political aims through technological means. And so there's this perceived threat about, government and corporate surveillance, and the answer is infrastructure, but it has to be self-infrastructured. It has to be that people, have and maintain control of their own infrastructure. And so this creates boundaries, but people are creating their own boundaries around their identity, how they organize, their relationships. And those boundaries are in relation to shared purposes, threats, and opportunities. And so what that really highlights is that the self-infrastructure is, it's analogous to the idea of these cypherpunk characters where this sort of intellectual lineage comes from of self-sovereignty and the sort of libertarian origins of, Silicon Valley and the Bay Area in the 90s, when these ideas kind of converged and resulted in the invention of Bitcoin, the first fully functional peer-to-peer blockchain, public blockchain. But obviously, to have a peer-to-peer network, it's a collective activity. So it's not just one person infrastructuring, it's these collective people kind of doing their self-infrastructuring. But when self-infrastructuring does not occur and people cannot set their own boundaries around their actions in relation to their goals, resilience breaks down. And I haven't gone too much into resilience in this presentation. I actually have sort of come full circle. I set out a little bit of my research design a couple of years ago on a seminar call. So that will be somewhere on the internet. But I have written and published about that just on my blog as well, if anyone's interested in more on how I define that. For the sake of this conversation, I want to continue on this idea of self-infrastructuring. So the core premises, as I said, infrastructure studies concept of infrastructuring, self-sovereignty, but it's a collective process, and then sort of linking to this politicization, or this ability to actually infrastructure new political arrangements or domains of activity. So how does this relate to the other literature? I was wondering if Nathan would be here, actually, Nathan Schneider. So Jason Potts et al. At the RMIT University Blockchain Innovation Hub are institutional economists, and they have developed the idea of blockchain networks as institutional infrastructure. So they're really looking at sort of following the electronic markets hypothesis. So looking at how you can have computational systems to organize through economic incentives as sort of an institutional arrangement. Wenger and others develop a community of practice. So shout out to my co-supervisor, Ellie Rennie, who does some work in this area. And communities of practice are where people come together to learn a new skill or practice that new skill. And so I would say in relation to that concept, self-infrastructuring is kind of an example of a specific community of practice. So self-infrastructuring with decentralized technologies could be called a community of practice, along with your local hackerspace, your local dog squad, whatever else. I would say community of practice is a more sort of general umbrella term that doesn't describe the specific requirements in decentralized technologies around open source, cryptographic, distributed digital infrastructure and all those things. And then Nathan Schneider and I had a thread in Metagov somewhere about Christopher Keltie's work on recursive publics, which is this idea of, which I don't super love calling people geeks, but geeks and hackers come together, and what they do through their practices of hacking and developing is they create these recursive publics. So again, that concept of publics that exists across the lineage of the literature around new spheres for people to participate in conversation and political activity and all of these kinds of things. Keltie uses free and open source software communities as an example of a recursive public. And I would say, decentralized technologies are another example that you could also call a recursive public. But what is described in self-infrastructuring is the kind of specific or unique attributes of this new toolkit for recursive publics. So if open source software is one way to engage in this kind of activity, decentralized technologies is an extension of that, and a quite powerful one, I would say. And so nearly there, how is self-infrastructuring occurring? Those main case studies that I mentioned that I've published on almost all of, there's a working paper on one of them. So algorithmically, people are self-infrastructuring through algorithms. And the example I use of this is Gitcoin DAO, where the DAO was at threat of Sybil attacks, so multiple fake identities. So they're getting attacked by spam bots where people are trying to game the system and access the public pot of money. And they create a machine learning pipeline within one of the sub-DAOs to detect Sybil attacks. So they sort of use algorithms against algorithms. And that's this way of self-infrastructuring. They had to design the algorithmic process. They had to figure out how they would govern an inherently centralized thing within a decentralized organizational structure, which had, all of, PII considerations and all of these things. And then they use algorithmic processes and their organizational infrastructure as a DAO to self-infrastructure against the threat of Sybil attacks. Full stack self-infrastructuring is an extension or an evolution of the idea of full stack software or full stack technology, which includes hardware and software. So every layer of the infrastructural stack, it's kind of an established sort of idea. You can have a full stack developer that does both front end and back end languages. But then you have full stack self-infrastructuring, and I draw a little bit on Latour's work here about the missing masses. And I say you can't look at infrastructure and decentralized technologies without considering the hardware. And my investigation is of Kongland, a crypto state that is developing open source microchips. And they manufacture and distribute these microchips to all other DAOs and projects that then want to use very good super glue to attach it to any physical object and have that verifiable through the NFC scanner on your mobile phone. So that's amazing for art that corresponds to NFTs. Clothing, Metafactory has had multiple lines of clothing where there's an embedded chip and you can scan that chip and kind of see the whole sort of origin and ownership. Hey, I got a little party symbol when I said Metafactory. And all these kinds of integrations that are really about connecting the digital and the physical. Again, that's kind of on the sort of progressive decentralized track to be governed by a DAO, but these people are really looking about at the cryptography at the microchip level, which is kind of the fundamental building block of your decentralized technologies. And then finally, institutional infrastructuring. This one's published in IEEE, and it was a case study on IPFS. And I look at what is called the gateway moment when infrastructure is bridged to connect it to other infrastructure or to scale. That comes out of some of the literature in infrastructure studies. And so the gateway moment for data management, when people address their content on the interplanetary file system or IPFS, is when they then need to store that content. And content needs to be stored in line with the person's preferences. You could say persistently for resilience, but perhaps they don't want that content to live forever, and that could actually compromise their safety or their NFT collection or whatever it is that they're storing. And so what I end up finding there is resilience can break down if people don't consider how they organize around their interactions with the technology or the protocol itself. And so what I've actually done since writing up this case study is I'm developing a pattern library with different institutional patterns, so pattern libraries around software development and repeatable software patterns that other people can, take and edit or hack on or compose or apply. But then there's also institutional patterns. So is it an individual that wants to store something and content address it and bridge it to that storage? Is it a group of people, but they need that data to remain local to their context, such as cultural information? Or is it something that can be stored globally on the Filecoin network, for example, or Arweave, and then you just negotiate your service level agreement with a storage provider, or you use Pinata or like a pinning service or whatever, and kind of make it, globally decentralized. And so these are my findings about self-infrastructuring in relation to resilience. So resilience is about self-infrastructuring. Self-infrastructuring is political, which I've mentioned, and the specific politics that comes from or evolves from. And resilience breaks down when self-infrastructuring does not occur. And so further resources, some of the links to the papers or publications that have come out of my to-be-finished thesis, which will hopefully be finished very soon. And yeah, happy to take any questions. Thank you so much for listening.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kelsie. I can ask a question first, but I want to leave. We just had a discussion about the text before you arrived. So would someone else like to kind of get us started? Okay, I'll venture one. Maybe, one way to kind of start the question is, you've gestured a couple times towards the kind of politics of self-infrastructuring. Can you just, I wonder if you could be a little more explicit about like how you would articulate that politics, what the kind of, what the priorities and motivations of that politics are? Is it kind of easily recognizable? Just I'm curious to hear a little more about, like, particularly the political side of your thinking here.
Yeah, it's a really good question because it is evolutionary in a sense. So the reasons that we're all here today and researching or studying or using decentralized technologies are multifaceted and heterogeneous, and I'm sure don't necessarily align with some of the political origins of these things. I mean, what you do as an ethnographer is you locate your field site. So I felt like I had to go back to some of the history of this stuff, especially the invention of public blockchains, in order to do that. The cypherpunk mailing lists are all kind of archived online. They have phenomenal documentation, although it's heavily weighted to the primary kind of mouthpieces or vocal or voice pieces of that community, such as Cyphernomicon, which sort of, is like this encyclopedia of all of their principles and ideas, but from the perspective of Timothy May. But they're in a very specific time and place. So I mentioned like 1990s Bay Area, beginning of the internet, the PGP kind of battles, or what some people call like the crypto wars, are happening. EFF, the Electronic Frontiers Foundation, exists, and is like supporting people like Phil Zimmerman on these. So it's a very specific time and place. And then the two kind of co-founders of the cypherpunks mailing list are Eric Hughes, who was kind of a young, keen software developer who actually worked with David Charm on DigiCash in Amsterdam. The report is like on the internet, random threads and files, it's like people didn't like his management style, and also that parts of the DigiCash infrastructure were centralized, and there was talk of negotiations with contracts with like Microsoft and banks and stuff. So again, like compromising on the sort of fully decentralized values and vision. He comes back to the US and connects with Tim May, who's like retired engineer from IBM, who's like done pretty well out of his IBM stocks, and like apparently is very libertarian. There's great books on this, and to the question in the chat, Michael, I'd point you to that publication, Crypto Economics as Governance, an intellectual history from crypto anarchy to crypto economics. And that's published open access. That lists a whole bunch of references from what I'm saying now. I definitely wasn't able to do kind of primary interviews with all of these characters, some of which are no longer alive, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, depending on what you think of like suicide markets and some of the really extreme ideas that came out of those communities. But they get together, and the cypherpunks started the online mailing list and had a couple of in-person meetups in the Silicon Valley area. So you can imagine that's like a very specific group of, white male technologists, Americans, that sort of have these ideas and about privacy, about surveillance. But I think the kind of brilliant insight here is that people that are technologically literate, that see the burgeoning kind of internet era and personal computing era, and they say like, hey, there's going to be massive problems with privacy, with identity. What is to stop this kind of Orwellian dystopia where, governments or powers out of our control can rewrite history through the control of digital information. And so that's why they start playing with electronic remailers, so kind of private message forwarding. And they, the whole kind of lineage comes through a lot of the characters that appear on that list of the building blocks of Bitcoin until the synonymous Satoshi Nakamoto launches those. So I'm more going into history than politics, apologies, but I'm trying to paint a thick description, like a really deep kind of picture of where these people are and the kind of perspectives that they're coming from. And so you could call that, more sort of right-wing libertarianism. I haven't spent a whole lot of time deep in the Bitcoin community, because from what I learned from it, by the time I was involved in crypto communities, it was like, why would you want to, given the kind of politics and infighting and obviously like heavy sort of technological bent. But then, I would say Ethereum, to give a different example today, has done a lot of effort to debunk, that sort of siloing political ideology that blockchain is, right-wing, or blockchain is libertarian or whatever, hence the rainbow emoji and this idea that like everyone's welcome and, come and build anything you want, and diversity and so on. So I would say that politics has greatly evolved, but is very important to understand, because that idea of having a right to participate still pervades these communities, in the sense of, permissionlessness to, to see what's going on, to acquire tokens in a system, and so on.
Yeah, thank you. I also shared a link in the chat. There's this interesting video from Nick Merrow where he kind of talks about the RAND corporation and the kind of that famous centralized, decentralized, distributed network mapping or like graphs. And he talks about how when the people who were supposed to implement that, or like the military officials who were looking at this document, when they saw that iconic image, they were most immediately gravitating towards decentralization, because they could see in that the US highway system that had just recently been constructed. And I think this was during the Cold War, and so they were kind of trying to emphasize this national infrastructure project that they had just done. And so it's just to say that like even like the kind of graphic conceptualization of decentralization can be traced back to kind of like, national pride or infrastructural pride as a kind of also like signaling mechanism in a kind of Cold War scenario. So I thought that was really interesting, and kind of something that I often wonder if like the reason that we kind of default or kind of want to go back towards decentralization is because it's like more easily recognizable and maybe a less technically challenging to implement than distributed technologies. And so I don't know, it's more of a comment, but I do wonder if like that also factors into the kind of politics of like the ideology of decentralization. I think Mel has a hand up.
Thanks, and thanks, Kelsie. This is awesome. Like really just solid work. Like I could spend weeks like working through this to try and get to and then probably will. So thank you. I guess what I'm kind of the place that I'm coming from is trying to develop technology that helps with this. And I've been working on that. Part of the challenge, at least as I see it, how do I put this? Like, I'm definitely like the white dude that feels like I have some advantage in this space because like I could build stuff, right? Like I can go hire a dev to do exactly what I tell them to do, and then they're going to build a thing that blah, blah, blah. The challenge isn't that, right? That's the easy part. The challenge as I see it then is like, how do I get the validation that what I'm doing isn't terrible? Because like maybe that is a real thing I'm facing right now. How do I get, like, besides showing up at this meeting and saying, hey, Kelsie, like read my paper, like what's the next, like what I guess would be your recommendation for say like policymakers to self-educate on self-infrastructuring technologies, like for more effective prevented like resiliency strategies, I guess, or I guess I'm sort of saying like I'm sort of like hearing everything and I'm like, yeah, but like what's next, I guess? Like what's the thing that happens that allows a better conversation to happen? Given that as when I read into this, maybe like one layer and definitely back me up if I'm taking it too far, but like I see a disappearing of like those cultural boundaries in ways that are going to feel uncomfortable, at a speed that's going to feel uncomfortable, maybe relative to even the way we transact, like, is very different from culture to culture. And I'm just going to like speak very plainly about, I was inside a DAO and you drop a democratic mechanism into a DAO and some people don't know how to use it the same way as others. And that's just because they weren't raised that way. Like I was, again, so I'll kind of park it there, I guess, because to say like I was raised in decentralized organizations that operated democratically, but that's because I'm, American to the core. Most people are not. And so I guess to say like the piece of this that I look at and I'm like, I see in the slide sort of the rise of the technological, sort of aspect, like the human development that's kind of happened in like a democratic sense, I think is advancing through time. Like even as a very democratic human getting into a DAO, I'm like, oh my God, like this is like, I came up with the phrase, like anything's democracy if you're brave enough, and that's kind of what it feels like, is like people were getting wrecked like real humans because it was like, hey, trust us. Yeah. Like quit your day job. And then they would. And then it was like, oh my God, what did they do? Like, and it was that sort of like them not understanding cyclical outcomes, those people representing cyclical outcomes, like, oh, I was elected to this position for 3 months. I can make statements like that. You get really bad recursive functions within human mechanisms based on what I'm going to call just like extremely open systems of, legitimized action that just that it falls. So I guess, yeah, with that, like, I said a lot there after I asked the question, I guess, but like, yeah, I guess just towards like those that are trying to do these things responsibly, how would you recommend that they engage with this, like, yeah, with the tech, self-organizing tech, self-infrastructure, which I think is such a cool term. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks so much for the question, Mel. I'll do my best to address some of the points raised, I guess. First of all, I'm not trying to make a value judgment on self-infrastructuring as good or bad. The contribution of an ethnographic work is really in those descriptions of what these communities are doing and how, and like kind of placing you as the reader, in in that context to understand it better. And so in relation to resilience, it's like, oh, well, like through all of these like really complicated circumstances and actions, they actually create resilience against the spam bots attacking them or whatever through their self-infrastructuring, or, you know, they don't. They address their content, but then they put it on their friend's server in a bedroom in Russia, and like then they don't have like very great you know, availability. So to come back, so again, I'm not trying to endorse self-infrastructuring, but then obviously there's all the nuance of you're doing digital ethnography, you're participating in these communities, everyone's like trying to get you to be their governor or their steward or their Senate person or like their volunteer or whatever, and you kind of become embroiled, and that's, you know, part of the ethnographic practice. So one idea, or a couple of ideas on the first thing about responsibility, something I actually wanted to mention to Seth's previous comment was Paul Barron from the 1960s. And this is my point about computationally literate people actually sort of being the best foretellers in a way. He has a piece on the engineer's responsibility, and his whole perspective is like, well, now that we have information infrastructure, there is a massive burden on the people that are able to code, because even if you're handed down requirements from your senior, you're the one who implements that infrastructure. And so self-infrastructuring even more, it's like you're actually making the subjective choices, you're training and parameterizing and tuning the algorithm, like whatever infrastructuring you're doing, it actually, you have quite a significant burden of responsibility. And so I think the topic of engineering ethics is like extremely underemphasized in the decentralized technology space, or quote unquote Web3. I was excited to see some of the comments coming out of the recent Dow Harvard event that was sort of like, hey, we should probably do more on ethics. Shout out to Michael Zargum, the founder and CTO of BlockScience, who has a piece on engineering ethics in Web3 on his blog from many years ago. And that's an ongoing conversation, research conversation. I'm at BlockScience as well, I should mention, for us. Amber Case as well is involved in those threads. I'm doing my postdoc project actually with the legal scholar folks at Blockchain Gov, and I'm looking at accountability and whether these communities can produce accountability, and I have a specific definition of that, through their self-governing actions. And so I want to look at how people use algorithms and social norms pretty much to do accountability. So there's sort of there's the protocol level rules and enforcement, but then there's like the off-chain stuff, which is way less tangible, which is a nice place as a social science researcher to look. So one is the engineer's responsibility. Self-infrastructuring means that there is a shift from kind of corporate responsibility or government responsibility to the self. How can you check what you're doing isn't terrible? Again, I'm not an expert in this, but you know, talk to users, do your market research. You know, in a lot of the consulting work we do at BlockScience, there's still like open questions about product market fit for a lot of this stuff. There's public goods, and then there's kind of like, how are you going to fund and maintain and sustain that? And if there's some kind of product or service revenue, then who are the users? All of those kind of basic startup questions. If you have the liberty of being involved in Metagov, try and corral someone into helping you with some design ethnography, which is that same thing. You know, that's what I do with the engineers at BlockScience. It's like looking at the social layer, or being in kind of some of the work that we've done sorry, I'm mind blanking, haven't had breakfast yet. It's around the ethnographer actually becoming a feedback loop in that system, which is second order cybernetics, which is an established thing from Mead and Bates, and you're nodding your head so you know. And we actually have a post on computer-aided ethnography that you might be interested in, which starts to explore some of the work that's been done. Again, shout out to Ellie and Metagov on the Telescope Bot project. But this idea that you can use computational methods even to help in your ethnography, but you're actually getting those feedback loops to end users and iterating based on kind of concrete insights. And then I think there was like a secondary question in there about policy, and I guess I'll go shorter rather than longer given that I've talked for a while, but how do you make policymakers more aware of this stuff? I think it's really, really hard. Originally, I was going to have a whole section on like past, present, futures and resilience and self-infrastructuring. And then that was just far too ambitious for one thesis. So I dropped the futures thing, but my mention of that in my conclusions is really that, you know, there's possibly two kind of parallel coexistent futures. I don't think that the future is self-infrastructuring from a, you know, my own kind of values or interests or ideology or whatever aside. It's like, I think, you know, the two things coexist. And I think nation states will probably continue for a while, legal systems, etc. And so you have both. And there's obviously, you know, stark tensions as we know at the moment. I mentioned I was speaking until late last night. That was the Lisbon DAO Observatory International Conference on DAO regulation or whatever. So there are these forums. Again, feedback I heard from the good folks that got to be at DAO Harvard last week was the kind of high-level contribution from one of the very well-regarded legal scholars there. And I wasn't there in person, so I won't quote them directly, but they were kind of like, you have a PR problem. As good as your technology is, you have to prove who it helps and how it helps. Because the SEC is after you all, as you can tell. So that's quite, I guess, sobering from that real world perspective of, you know, as good and interesting and innovative and creative as all this stuff is, it still has to interface with existing systems, infrastructures.
Thank you. That was awesome. And thanks for all the call outs of resources. Really appreciate it.
Should we do one more question from Brooke and Mike each? Do either of you have questions?
I could bring up the earlier point that we were discussing I made, which is, yeah, thanks for all this. And it seems like self-infrastructure is necessary, but not sufficient for resilience. And especially thinking about sort of historical or traditional ways of organizing and doing things. Many of those mechanisms had self-infrastructure, i.e. like self-organization might be the better term. But they did fail despite that. And that sort of seems to me to just be an orthogonal consideration to be made.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. I guess I still have a ways to go in this kind of final tinkering with my language around this, and especially, yeah, really ensuring that relationship between self-infrastructuring and resilience is fully fleshed out. Because it's like when self-infrastructuring does not occur, resilience breaks down. And in decentralized technology communities, if self-infrastructuring is not possible, it cannot be considered resilient. You know, you can't say, oh, just hand me your private keys, but like you can participate in this thing. You're like, no, like I have to do it and I have to kind of own it or own that access or whatever on certain parameters. But yeah, is it sufficient? I did a lot of methodological work developing out how to even look at that, which has sort of become an applied analytical method around vulnerabilities. That came out of the literature as an adjacent concept to resilience. And so if you can identify vulnerabilities in a system and address them, you can become more resilient. And so I've actually practiced that with a number of DAOs now. It's publicly facing the report that I did with the team at BlockScience on Lido DAO. And again, that was just a really incredible experience. I had published some methods from my research about DAO vulnerabilities, looking at the social, technical, economic, legal parameters. And then they were like, cool, come and assess our DAO. Wrapping up something similar with Filecoin at the moment, thanks to BlockScience as well. So yeah, I don't know if you can ever guarantee resilience on all of those parameters because they're dynamic systems. But this is as far as I've gotten.
Before turning to Mel, I just wanted to see, Brooke, do you have any questions you might want to add?
No questions, just really well done, Kelsie. I've found a lot of value out of these papers for myself and my own work and thinking and framing the questions I want to ask. I have some broad questions, but this has given me some really good literature and to dig into, and some really good frameworks to think through some of the problems I've been thinking through. So thanks, well done.
Cool, let's catch up. I'd love to hear more about your research as it forms.
Cool. Okay, Mel.
Thanks. I guess my last question, does this create a sort of collapse down to maybe the exact thing that is I guess being framed as like the designer, the tech designer becomes the autocrat, right? In a sense, like how do I put this? What's being called self-infrastructure is like modular infrastructure with group control, right? And if that's the case, how do you push, beyond this, like, okay, well, we all control the thing now, right? That's the Dunbar challenge. And I guess, so I guess the question would be, wouldn't you recurse down to a function where you're just designing your own kind of prison sort of like eternally in like a self-infrastructure sense, unless you're integrating and adopting other infrastructure all along the way, at which point you're losing the exact resiliency you're kind of talking about, like as a function of being a coordinating like human, I guess. Does that make, sorry, I don't know if I said that really badly, but I'll just park it there and hope that you got enough to respond.
Yeah, I got enough to respond. I definitely don't have enough to solve. I think it's a massive, I mean, this is what I said at the DAO thing yesterday. I'm like, I didn't say it's kind of amusing, but I said like, these things are figments. Like DAOs aren't really a thing. They're like kind of a thing that people are calling DAOs, and like, but we're progressively decentralizing, but we haven't done it yet. 2014 was some of the first mention of the idea of DAOs within the context of blockchain technology, and they're not in their end state either. Like, look at what's happening with auto GPs and AI and everything. In relation to that original vision, might I say. The first piece in the further resources that I shared is called Web3 is self-infrastructuring. It's really, there is a distinction between decentralized technologies and Web3. I more just kind of took the opportunity to publish because the cycles are really long and slow, and I had the self-infrastructuring thing and I was writing on Web3. I'm like, hey, let me say this. The challenge is how. And so that's really a commentary on like, here's all of these ideas and context and like kind of what some of these decentralized technology communities are about, but it's really freaking hard to do. And like, it's not solved. I have another piece on Friends with Benefits where I did this really amazing, like in-person ethnography, like kind of almost like auto ethnography thing, because I got to go to their like 3-day festival in Idlewild in the forest. And that same thing, they have this really vibrant community, this really clear purpose. And and then they take on VC capital, and then it's like, well, how does decentralized governance work in this kind of multi-stakeholder system? And, you know, like the challenge is how, like the ideas are there, the kind of political like ideology, you know, like the culture, some tooling is being built, but yeah, it's definitely not clear cut. And to your point before about, you know, democracy through and through, like these infrastructures do change in different cultures. I mean, that's part of the insight from the Filecoin research I'm doing. They have a massive amount of storage providers, or a significant amount of storage providers in China. It's a very different culture, let alone legislative environment for crypto type projects, to the US, to the Europe, where there's another kind of whole block of storage providers. So the way that they participate in the governance of that system is very different according to their geography and culture of the people participating. And I actually just submitted an abstract last night to build on some of the work I did a while ago on DAOs and cooperatives, to gather a bit more data on what does democracy mean in crypto communities, because I think that is like a vastly abused term. And I love that co-ops really clearly define what that means around labor and ownership. And yeah, I think that needs a bit of further investigation.
I'll just respond real quick. I did a quick little presentation on democracy. I forget what I even called it, but it was like testing, adjusting, and maybe like balancing the ancient, or testing, adjusting, and automating the ancient balance of power. And it was really just a survey of like DAOs, you know, from like maybe a hype perspective. But I really did kind of, how do I put this? I read about this stuff all the time, like right down to the origins of language, the origins of government, like all of that. Like, why do we do anything we do is sort of the approach I've taken. But I guess all that just to say, I don't know where you publish most, but I'd love to just, I already followed you on Medium, but I'd like to just keep up, because I think I'm aligned with like at least the journey of where you're at, and would love to at least stay kind of at the forefront of the research, because I feel activist sometimes, even though I'm just trying to advance better conversations.
Yeah, no worries. I'll send you a link to my GitHub, which has it all, but I would love to see your presentation if it was recorded or you have notes.
Yeah, Mel, where do you publish? You mentioned that you've written a lot.
Yeah, here, I'll drop some links in the chat. I've started this up on my phone and I'm regretting it, because I have like I'm up on my so I don't have Slack on my computer, but I'll type out some links for you. But I have a GitHub that I just started up for specifically a methodology that really turns into a lot of like mechanisms that are like very, I would say, clash, like almost like right with what you're talking about. As self-infrastructuring tech. Like, and I'm talking to Optimism actively about building like the thing that could launch 10,000 DAOs in a week, you know. And then me personally, I'm ex-index coop for a couple of years, but I did financial controls, integrity monitoring, and private investigations before that. So really like the intersection of like people, money, and all the most horrible things you can imagine. And that's probably why I just decided I needed to like invent something that solves it all in one fell swoop, rather than like write the next best book. But it's tough, because I'm working almost backwards now, where I'm like, yo, look at this stuff. It's like, it solves a lot of these problems. So anyway, that's me, but I'll drop the links in.
Thanks. But Kelsie, my question for you is, you mentioned there was a distinction between like decentralized something tech and Web3, or something to that effect. I was hoping you could draw out that distinction for me.
Yeah, definitely. It depends on your perspective. That piece that I published is one of the first peer-reviewed pieces on Web3. It references something by Ellie Rennie and Jason Potts, where they're talking about Web3 in the creative industries.
I think I've read that one.
Yeah, a few other bits and pieces around. Web3 evokes the idea of Web 2. And this kind of like, oh, it's the natural evolution of the internet. Like, it's inevitable, you know, decentralized technologies of the future. So some would argue, such as one of my colleagues at BlockScience, that Web3 is a marketing term invented by Silicon Valley to create hype and generate venture capital investment opportunities, or raise for funds. What I tried to do in this piece was define Web3 according to how I would define decentralized technologies, and I just went into some of that. A really good piece to read in conjunction with this one is by Jathan Sadowski, I think you pronounce his surname, who's part of ADMS, and Caitlin Siegel. And that is like a scathing review also in Big Data and Society about Web3 as kind of expansion and contraction, and that it all comes from Silicon Valley and it's all like empty promises and stuff. So I guess that they went the like Web3 is like not a thing, and like not a thing that we want to be a thing. And I went, you know, hey, look, people are trying to use infrastructure and create new ways to coordinate. And all I'm saying is that piece is like, I've used infrastructure studies as a theoretical lens to inquire more. Like maybe you can think about that as a lens too, and go have a look.
Yeah, I really appreciated the distinction you made between Web 3.0 and Web 3. I honestly thought they were the same until I read that, and I was like, oh, okay, that is actually a really useful like distinction to have in my mind. So very much appreciated.
Credit. I think that actually came from Ellie in a comment somewhere or something like, you have the wrong concept. And I was like, oh gosh. But I've since anonymously peer reviewed stuff by like amazing academics that I have a lot of respect for. And the same thing has occurred in terms of like 3.0 and 3. So it was good to get the publication out there.
And this piece by Sadowski and Beagle, is this like a peer-reviewed publication, or is this like on his podcast or like a blog?
It's in Big Data and Society, so peer-reviewed.
Perfect, thanks.
So if there's no more questions, we're at the top of the second hour for today's face call. You've all been wonderful participants. No, seriously, it's so lovely to connect with each of you. Thank you for listening and engaging with the work. If you have other ideas that are complementary or how to improve or in any sense related to, feel free to reach out in the Metagov Slack.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kelsie.
Thank you. Really cool. The way it's referenced to is absolutely incredible. Again, thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.